What happens when a father's calm love clashes with a single, devastating act aboard a plane at 35,000 feet? Imagine watching helplessly as the one thing that keeps your child alive. The only hope for his rare illness is snatched away, discarded in an instant by a flight attendant following rules she refuses to question. This is not just a story about a vial of medicine. It's a story about fear, misunderstanding, and the quiet strength of a boy named Elijah and his father Malcolm, who faces a world that refuses to see them fully. How far will one man go to protect his son when everything seems to be against them? What does it say about the rules we follow and the humanity we lose when we forget why those rules exist? Join us as we journey through a flight-turned-nightmare, a battle for life and dignity, and the unexpected moments of courage that can rewrite everything. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Let's dive into the story that will challenge how you see justice and compassion at 35,000 feet. The low hum of jet engines vibrated through the cabin, a sound that Eden most faded into the background of travel. But to Malcolm Grant, it was a subtle reminder that he and his son were suspended in a fragile space between fear and hope. Flight 719 was 3 hours into its journey from Newark to San Diego, slicing through the sky at 35,000 feet. Outside the window, clouds floated like soft scaffolding beneath the vast, endless blue. Inside, tray tables were down, movies were playing, and seatbacks reclined just enough to remind you that comfort at 35,000 feet was relative. In seat 17A, Elijah Grant, age 7, sat cross-legged. A stack of crayons spread across his tray table. His face was a portrait of intense concentration as he filled in the wings of his superhero. Skyblade. Blue and silver streaks danced across the page, his small hand trembling only slightly. To anyone else, he looked like any child lost in a world of imagination. But Malcolm watched closely, too closely. His eyes didn't just see a boy drawing. They registered every twitch in Elijah's fingers, every second of stillness that stretched too long. He'd learned to read his son's body the way others read weather reports. Any change, no matter how small, could signal a coming storm. Elijah had Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, a rare and severe form of epilepsy, the kind that defied most treatments, laughed in the face of conventional meds, and turned childhood into a battlefield. There were seizures that looked like daydreams, and others that came like hurricanes, violent, consuming, and cruel. Today's flight was not for leisure. They weren't going on vacation. This was a mission, a lifeline. After 8 months of advocacy, clinical evaluations, and bureaucratic tightropes, Elijah had been accepted into a clinical trial at the California Neurological Research Institute. The treatment, known as CBX-9, was an experimental compound that offered something rare in their world, hope. And in Malcolm's seat pocket sat a small black insulated pouch. Inside that pouch, wrapped in a cold pack, was the vial. A single, clear tube of liquid that had no label and no price tag because it wasn't for sale. It had been hand-prepared in a Calix Biosolutions lab just days ago, with Elijah's patient ID written in tiny blue ink on a tag tied to the cap. He had already administered the morning dose at the airport, timed precisely to their schedule. The next one was due at 3:00 p.m. Pacific time, less than an hour away. That vial had to stay cold. It had to be taken on time. It had to be there. Malcolm checked his watch. 2:04 p.m. Still time, still okay. He reached out and gently touched Elijah's shoulder. The boy looked up and smiled. "How's Skyblade doing?" "He's almost finished," Elijah replied, holding up his picture. "He's flying to the rescue. He always makes it just in time." Malcolm smiled, but there was a tightness behind it. "Just like you, buddy. Just like you." A few rose up. Janet Holloway pushed the beverage cart down the aisle with practiced ease. At 47, she had been flying for over 2 decades. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her hair pinned into a tight bun, and her expression unreadable. She had seen it all: the crying babies, the screaming adults, the entitled, the lost, the exhausted. And after years of service, she had developed a system. Everyone on board was a variable to be managed. Efficiency was compassion. Precision was safety. Deviations were risk. Her eyes flicked quickly over each row. Magazines, iPads, snack wrappers, drawing pads. Her gaze landed on the small black pouch peeking out from the seatback pocket in front of 17A. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't clear what it was. Not a tablet, not a book, not a neck pillow. She made a mental note. Not urgent, but worth checking later. She reached Malcolm's row and offered him a drink. He declined politely. She paused a beat longer than necessary, her eyes scanning Elijah's picture and then returning briefly to the pouch. Then she nodded and moved on. Malcolm's instincts stirred. The way her eyes lingered, it was subtle, but he had felt it before. The scrutiny, the curiosity wrapped in professionalism, the kind that sometimes came with being a black father, traveling alone with a child who didn't speak much, who looked still. He shook it off. No trouble, no waves. Just stay calm. Stay ready. He leaned over and whispered to Elijah. "You want juice when they come back, Apple?" Elijah said without looking up. "Got it." Malcolm smiled again, this time more easily. The moment settled again. From the rear of the plane, Janet continued her route. As she reached the galley, her smile faded. She opened a narrow cabinet and pulled out her manual. Not because she needed it, but because she liked being thorough. She liked being right. She flipped to the section on in-cabin items. She read through it carefully, even though she knew it by heart. Liquids over 3.4 ounces were subject to TSA regulation. Unlabeled liquids, suspicious packaging, passenger non-compliance. Her brother had died at 19, a college party. A vial of something someone said was just a vitamin drop. It wasn't. It stopped his heart in 3 minutes. Since then, she had never trusted small vials, never trusted what people said they needed. It wasn't racism. She told herself that more than once. It was safety, rules, order. As she closed the manual, back in 17A, Malcolm felt a flutter of unease settle into his chest. He adjusted the pouch slightly, making sure it stayed nestled in the cooling sleeve. He checked the zipper, checked the time again. 2:10. Elijah had moved on to drawing Skyblade's cape flapping in the wind. His tongue stuck out slightly. Focused and content, Malcolm let out a slow breath and looked out the window. The clouds were endless, the sky bright. From the outside, this flight looked like any other. But inside, something fragile was ticking, a countdown, and somewhere in the galley, a decision was beginning to form. Malcolm Grant had learned, over time, to carry a fortress with him. It wasn't made of brick or stone, not something visible to the eye. It was made of folded documents, laminated cards, medical printouts, and emails converted into PDFs. He kept it tucked in a gray folder inside his carry-on, alongside Elijah's medications, 2 juice boxes, a backup iPad, and a copy of The Little Prince that Elijah had once declared his favorite, even though he never read past chapter 3. It had taken years to build that fortress. Each doctor's note, every diagnosis letter, the approval from Calyx Biosolutions with its official seal, all laminated now to survive rain, spills, or suspicion. It was all there, zipped away, like armor, because he knew what the world could be like, especially at airports, especially when you looked like him. Malcolm wasn't a man who invited confrontation. He had been raised to be composed, respectful, careful. He knew the volume of his voice could be mistaken for aggression, the expression on his face misread as defiance. So he didn't raise his voice. He raised his preparation. When he flew with Elijah, he wore business casual, clean sneakers, pressed collars, not because he liked it, but because it made things easier, more acceptable. He had a system. Arrive early, speak first, smile without showing too many teeth. Make eye contact, but not too long. When asked questions, lead with documentation. Always bring backup. It was exhausting, but it was safer. He glanced at his son, now gently nodding off with Skyblade tucked under his chin. The crayon still rested loosely in his fingers. The sight made Malcolm's heart pull in two directions at once, pride and dread. He checked his watch again. 2:28 p.m. 32 minutes until the next dose. The medicine, CBX-9, had no smell, no color, no commercial label. It wasn't available in pharmacies. The trial required that he carry it personally. It had to remain cold, away from light, undisturbed. Calyx had even warned that turbulence could compromise the compound if shaken too much. They'd provided a cooling sleeve, and Malcolm had added his own insulated pouch to double the protection. The small vial inside that pouch, now nestled 3 feet from his knee, represented 10 years of research, a multi-million-dollar study, and for him, the entire future of his son. He had triple-checked it before boarding, cleared security without issue. TSA barely gave it a second glance, probably assuming it was insulin. He had the approval letter ready, but they didn't ask. But now, as the memory of the flight attendant's lingering gaze lingered like a shadow in the back of his mind, Malcolm felt that old tension return, the one that never fully left his shoulders, the one that whispered, "Be ready. They'll ask. They'll question. And you'll have to defend." He opened his bag and reached for the gray folder. Just checking. Just in case. The first page was the diagnosis from Dr. Choi, Elijah's pediatric neurologist. The second was the clinical approval from Calyx's trial administrator, complete with signatures, QR code, patient ID. After that, letters from the pharmacy partner, temperature storage instructions, flight clearance printouts, all official, all real. Still, he knew better than to expect it to matter. He remembered a moment 3 years ago, standing in line at a pharmacy with Elijah in his arms. The pharmacist had raised her voice, questioning why he needed 2 syringes. He had calmly explained that one was a rescue dose. She had insisted he was gaming the system, the stares in line, the heat in his face, the quiet way Elijah had squeezed his shirt when things got loud. It had been resolved, eventually, but the damage stayed. He looked back at his son, who was now stirring lightly. Elias' face, even in sleep, was thoughtful. He had inherited his mother's quietness, her deep gaze, her sense of stillness. Elia had started seizing at 7 months old. The first one had lasted 4 minutes. It felt like a century. They had raced to the ER in a storm, hydroplaning once on the freeway. The doctors had worked fast, but it was the moment afterward Malcolm remembered most, the sound of monitors, the beep, beep rhythm of stability. and Elijah's tiny fingers curling around his thumb when it was over. That was the night Malcolm started building the fortress. In the rear galley. Janet Holloway sipped her tea and stared blankly ahead. The familiar drone of flight filled her ears, a sound she once loved. Not today. She hadn't stopped thinking about the pouch, the small black item in the seatback pocket, the man's calmness, the way he had watched her. She knew people like him, not personally, but in training sessions, in the compliance modules, the ones who knew how to say the right things, who knew how to appear credible, and sometimes they weren't what they seemed. She had been burned before. Her brother, Daniel, had trusted someone who said the drops were safe, just helps you sleep. The guy had told him, it's all natural. Daniel had died before the paramedics arrived. Since then, Janet had trusted only rules. She opened the service manual again. Page 14. Unlabeled liquids, subject to review, especially if over the TSA limit, especially if not declared at boarding, especially if the passenger becomes confrontational. She remembered the pouch, no label, no visible prescription. A strange, cold pack. She hadn't seen him declare anything. She flipped the page. Suspicious substances. Protocol removed from cabin if deemed unsafe or unclear. Use discretion. Discretion. That word left a bad taste in her mouth. It left too much to chance. She told herself this wasn't about race. It wasn't about him being a black man. It wasn't about the boy looking a little pale, a little too still. It wasn't about any of that. It was about the vial, about the risk. She closed the manual. In seat 17A. Malcolm felt the shift. He didn't know what made him look up at that exact moment. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was sixth sense all fathers of sick children develop. But when he looked up, Janet was standing a few rows back, watching him again. Their eyes met. He gave a polite nod, a small smile. She didn't return it. She turned and walked away. The moment left a silence in its wake. Malcolm turned to his son and gently touched his arm. "Alicia," he whispered. "Wake up, buddy." Elijah blinked slowly. "Are we there yet?" "Not yet, but almost time for your medicine." "Oh, okay." He reached into the pouch, not opening it, just feeling the weight. It was still cold, still safe. For now, outside, the sky looked calm. Inside, something else was forming. Not a storm, not yet, but the wind had shifted, and Malcolm could feel it. By the time the cabin lights dimmed for cruising altitude, Malcolm Grant had already entered countdown mode. He glanced at his watch again. 2:16 P.M. Pacific time. 44 minutes. Elijah's next dose was at 3 sharp. Not 3:01. Not around 3. The protocol was explicit. The CBX-9 compound had to be given in 4-hour windows. No exceptions. Deviating by more than 10 minutes meant data corruption and potentially reduced efficacy. The dose window wasn't just about scheduling. It was about science, neurons, and safety. And for Malcolm, it was about keeping Elijah breathing through the night. The little boy was now fully awake, drawing again, humming softly under his breath. Skyblade had grown wings in this version, with lightning bolts streaking down his arms. He was flying into battle against a shadowy monster made of scribbled black lines. Malcolm smiled. Who's Skyblade fighting now? Elijah didn't look up. The Blackout King. Sounds dangerous. He is, but Skyblade's faster. There was a pause. Malcolm reached down and felt the pouch again. Still cool, still there, but something inside him felt unsettled. When the moment came, it didn't arrive with shouting or alarm bells. It arrived with a tight smile and the clicking of low heels in the aisle. Janet Holloway had returned. She wasn't pushing a drink cart this time. She wasn't making eye contact with the passengers around her. She had the look of someone on a mission, the type of purposeful walk that comes not from confidence, but from conviction. Malcolm saw her from the corner of his eye. "Excuse me, sir." He turned fully toward her. "Yes, I need to speak with you about the pouch in your seat pocket." He didn't move at first. He wanted to believe he had misheard. "I'm sorry. The black insulated pouch, it was not declared at boarding, and I've been instructed to check any unmarked substances for safety compliance. May I see it? Please." Her voice was polite, crisp, even, but it was not a request. It was a decision disguised as a question. Malcolm breathed in through his nose, slow and controlled. "Of course," he said. He reached forward, retrieved the pouch, and placed it carefully on his tray table. "This contains my son's medication," he explained, unzipping it slowly, letting her see the cold pack, the carefully swaddled vial, and the clear tube of CBX-9. "It's part of a clinical trial. I have documentation if you'd like to see it. I'd like you to hand it to me." Malcolm blinked. "I'm sorry, I need to inspect it more closely." Janet said, "Please hand it to me." Malcolm kept his voice low. Even Elijah had stopped drawing. The boy was watching now, eyes wide and unsure. "I'm happy to show you the documentation. This is temperature sensitive and not replaceable. Handling it improperly could damage the dose." "That's not the issue," Janet replied. "This is an unlabeled liquid in an unmarked vial. It was not declared. It is a security concern." "I assure you," Malcolm said, trying hard not to let frustration rise. "We passed TSA with this. It was reviewed. I have the approval letter here. My son's condition is extremely time-sensitive. If he misses this dose, I don't need the letter." "Sir." That stopped him. "I'm sorry I don't need the letter," she repeated. "This substance is not properly labeled and is in violation of cabin liquid protocols. It presents a risk. I am required to confiscate it." She reached forward. Malcolm instinctively placed his hand over the pouch. His other hand reached into his carry-on for the gray folder, moving slowly. "I have the letter from Calyx Biosolutions, the trial sponsor. I also have the hospital directive and TSA boarding clearance. I don't want to cause a scene, but I think you're misunderstanding what this is. Sir, please remove your hand from the item." Passengers nearby were beginning to turn. Not all, but enough. Heads tilted. Conversation slowed. Malcolm looked down at Elijah. The boy's eyes were wide now, his mouth slightly open. "You said we were okay," he whispered. Malcolm's heart broke a little at that. "We are, son." Janet reached forward again. Before Malcolm could move, she had the vial in her hand. "No," he said. "Too late." She turned on her heel and walked quickly toward the front of the cabin. The pouch remained on his tray, empty now. He tried to unbuckle, but his fingers fumbled on the latch. By the time he was out of his seat, she was already in the galley. He called after her, his voice not loud, but urgent. "Please don't." He didn't finish. The sound came next, a dull crunch, a hydraulic hiss, the trash compactor. Malcolm stood frozen. The cabin fell silent. Elijah began to cry. At first, it was soft. Then came the shaking. Malcolm sat down again, his legs weak beneath him. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, gently. "I need to speak to the purser," he said quietly, not looking up. "I'm sorry, Daddy," Eli whispered, tears rolling silently. "No, No, no, sweetheart. This wasn't your fault. The silence in the cabin deepened. Across the aisle, a young woman with long braids pulled a phone from her lap and tapped the screen. She had recorded everything from the moment Janet arrived at their row. Her name was Tiana Brooks. She knew a story when she saw one, but even she didn't yet realize just how big this one would be. Janet returned from the galley, face unreadable. She opened her mouth, prepared to explain, to defend, to recite policy. But Malcolm wasn't shouting. He wasn't even looking at her. He was looking out the window, one hand still gently rubbing Elijah's back as the boy trembled. "You didn't just throw away a vial," Malcolm said softly. "You threw away the only thing that's kept my son alive for the past year." There was no accusation in his voice, only heartbreak. Janet's mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, her professional armor faltered. She hadn't expected that. She had braced for yelling, demands, threats, but not this. Not quiet devastation, not this terrifying calm. The purser arrived, a man named Noah Kim. He approached with practiced calm. "Is there a problem here?" "Yes," Malcolm said. Finally turning, he looked directly at Janet, then back to Noah. "She just destroyed my son's experimental medication, a treatment that is irreplaceable, time-dependent, and part of a federal clinical trial." Noah's face shifted from neutral to alarm. "Do you have documentation?" Malcolm held up the gray folder. Everything, and the dose gone. He looked down at Elijah. The boy's face was pale, his body starting to shake. "His next seizure will come in less than 30 minutes. Noah reached for the handset. In the cockpit, a voice crackled through the line. Captain Teresa Langford leaned toward it. "Go ahead. We have a medical emergency. Possible seizure risk. Passenger reports destroyed experimental treatment. Clinical trial involved. Requesting immediate escalation." Captain Langford glanced at her co-pilot, Miles Jensen, who was already pulling up the nearest emergency diversion options. "Denver, 40 minutes away." Langford nodded. "Tell the cabin to prepare, and get that father back in his seat." The cabin air felt heavier now. Not just pressurized, but weighted with something invisible. An emotion that clung to the backs of passenger necks and made them glance down the aisle toward row 17. No one said it out loud, but everyone had felt the moment the hum of routine was broken, when the flight attendant walked to the front with a clear vial and came back without it. When the boy started to cry. When the father went still. Malcolm Grant was motionless, his hand resting on Elijah's back, his breath measured like someone holding back a scream by counting seconds between heartbeats. He felt the pain rising in his chest, but he refused to let it take over. He couldn't. Not with Elijah shaking beside him, not with passengers watching, not with his son's dose now crushed into a slurry of glass and hope in the belly of the aircraft. He looked at Noah Kim, the purser, who stood near the aisle, his face pale but professional. "I need to speak with the captain," Malcolm said. "I understand, sir," Noah replied. "We've already relayed the information to the cockpit. They're reviewing options." "Options?" Malcolm's voice barely rose above a whisper, but it had weight. "Yes, sir. The captain is considering a medical diversion. We're confirming the closest airport with proper medical facilities." Malcolm nodded slowly. "Tell her we need to land. He has under 30 minutes. Noah hesitated. "Is there anything you need for your son in the meantime?" "A replacement vial," Malcolm said bitterly, "which doesn't exist." Elijah curled toward him, his head resting against his father's chest. His lips were moving, silently. Maybe a prayer, maybe just a tremble, maybe trying to call Skyblade. Malcolm kissed the top of his head. From the forward galley, Janet Holloway stood behind the curtain divider, hands clenched behind her back, staring at nothing. Her breath came in short, shallow pulls. She hadn't meant for this. She had followed procedure. At least she thought she had. The manual was clear. Unlabeled substances were a risk. She had seen the vial. No label. No prescription. Just clear liquid in a suspicious container. She had asked him to hand it over. He hadn't complied immediately. He'd tried to show her papers instead. He'd delayed. That counted as non-compliance, didn't it? But now, standing there, she felt something else crowding into her mind. What if he had been telling the truth? What if that liquid wasn't just medicine, but the only thing keeping that child safe from something worse than she could imagine? She tried to remind herself of Daniel, her brother. The night he died, the vial he drank from, that turned out to be poison. The police officer had called it a bad batch. No one was charged. Her mother had never been the same. Since then, Janet had vowed no unlabeled vials, no exceptions. She rubbed her fingers against her wrist, the spot where her brother's bracelet had once dangled on her own hand after he passed. It was long gone now, lost in a move or a hotel drawer. Still, the weight of it felt real. She stepped out of the galley and walked down the aisle slowly, as if the plane had grown longer. She wasn't sure what she meant to say. Maybe nothing. When she reached row 17, Malcolm didn't look at her. Elijah had started to tremble, small jerks running through his fingers. Janet swallowed. "Sir," she said quietly, "if you had just declared, 'What have you done?'" Malcolm's voice cut clean through her words, soft but razor sharp. Janet faltered. She started. "You didn't listen." Malcolm continued. "You saw a vial and made a decision. You didn't ask. You didn't verify. You destroyed something irreplaceable." Janet opened her mouth again, but he kept going, each word landing with chilling clarity. "You didn't throw away a liquid. You threw away a layer of safety, one that took 8 months to earn, one that cost us sleep, tears, tests, procedures, phone calls, long nights, long days, and miles of bureaucratic red tape. You threw away what little control I had left." She took a small step back. "I thought it was a risk," she whispered. "You were right," Malcolm said, still looking at Elijah. "It was, but not the kind you imagined." Noah returned, his face tight with urgency. "Mr. Grant, the captain is initiating a diversion. We're heading to Denver International. We've got 39 minutes until landing. Medics are being dispatched to the gate." Malcolm nodded. Janet stepped back further, then turned and walked down the aisle, her heart thudding against her ribs. Across the aisle, Tiana Brooks kept her phone tilted discreetly. She had captured most of what had happened. Not for the drama, not even for the views, for the truth. And now, as she replayed the footage in silent review, her own hand started to shake. The weight of it was real. The cruelty wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, policy-wrapped, and procedural. That made it worse. She began editing a short clip. Not for social media yet, but for something. Maybe someone would listen. Maybe someone needed to. Back in the cockpit, Captain Teresa Langford adjusted their course. The cabin crew had cleared the diversion announcement. Denver Air Traffic Control had approved the emergency landing. Runway 35L was being held. Teresa rubbed her forehead. "This is going to get ugly," she said. Miles Jensen, her co-pilot, nodded. "Calyx Biosolutions. I looked them up. This is serious. They've got a global reputation." "I know," she said. And the second that man said clinical trial and destroyed dose, it became a nightmare. "Is the FAA going to ask questions Teresa didn't answer immediately?" "Yes," she finally said. "And so will Calix. And so will every media outlet by morning." In the cabin. Malcolm held Elijah close. The tremors were increasing. Elijah's breathing was shallow. A faint sweat had formed on his brow. Malcolm reached into the carry-on again, pulled out an emergency seizure kit. It wasn't the trial dose. It wouldn't stop the progression, only slow it. But it was all he had now. He turned to Noah. "Can you ask if there's a neurologist on board?" "I already did," Noah replied. "A woman in row 9 identified herself. She's coming now." A tall woman in a gray blazer approached, crouched beside Malcolm's seat. "Dr. Lenora Stein, pediatric neurologist. I'm on my way to a conference in San Diego." Malcolm looked at her like she was a miracle. She missed her dose. CBX-9. Part of a Calix trial. The flight attendant. "I know, Dr. Stein said gently. "I saw." She reached for Elijah's wrist, feeling his pulse, then looked up. "He's in preictal phase. We're minutes away. I'll monitor him until we land. But we need to get him off this plane fast." The plane began to descend. Oh, Malcolm could feel the shift, both in altitude and in fate. He held Elijah tighter, whispered into his ear, "You're okay. You're safe. Skyblade is still with you." Elijah didn't answer, but his hand reached up and curled around his father's fingers. And Malcolm held on like it was the only thing left in the world. The moment the plane came to a complete stop, everything happened at once. Lights flooded the aisle. The emergency exit door hissed open before any passenger could reach for their overhead bag. 3 paramedics boarded briskly, led by a woman with short gray hair and a radio clipped to her shoulder. Behind them, 2 airport security officers stood at the base of the jet bridge, along with a man in a dark suit holding a clipboard. Malcolm didn't flinch. Elijah lay limp in his arms, his breathing rapid but shallow. His skin was warm and damp. Dr. Stein stood and made space as the medics arrived. "He's pre-seizure," she told them calmly. 7 years old. Clinical trial patient. Emergency dose was destroyed mid-flight. We administered diazepam 15 minutes ago." The lead medic nodded and turned to Malcolm. "Sir, we need to transfer him to the gurney." Malcolm hesitated. Elijah's body was so small, so fragile, and the movement might trigger what they were trying to delay. "I'll ride with him," he said. "Absolutely," the medic replied. "We've cleared the ambulance for both of you." Gently, they lifted Elijah, wrapping him in soft blankets before laying him on the stretcher. His eyelids fluttered. His fingers twitched, but he didn't speak. Malcolm held his hand the entire way down the aisle. As they passed by, row 9, Dr. Stein gave a quiet nod, as if passing a torch. Janet Holloway stood frozen near the galley, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. As Malcolm walked by, he looked at her once, just once. No words, no anger. But the look was worse than either. It was the silence of a man who had nothing left to say. Tiana Brooks followed at a distance, still recording. She kept her phone low, almost reverent. She wasn't after drama. She was after documentation. Someone needed to remember this. Every detail. The gurney disappeared through the jet bridge. Malcolm's shoulders remained upright, but every step looked heavier. Captain Teresa Langford removed her headset and stood. She turned to Miles. "You have the flight." "Miles, I need to speak with ground." "You sure?" She gave a sharp nod. Teresa didn't usually leave the cockpit first. It wasn't standard. But today, standards were shifting faster than procedure could catch up. When she entered the terminal, she saw the group immediately. Aurelia Air's Denver station manager stood with 2 suits from corporate and a tall woman in a gray skirt suit who wore a lanyard that read Calix Biosolutions, Savannah Rhodes. Teresa had never met her in person, but the name was known across aviation circles. She was the executive liaison between Calix Research Division and the FAA's Medical Clearance Board. If Savannah was here in person, this wasn't just a PR issue. This was a crisis. Savannah's expression was composed but cold. She scanned the disembarking passengers, eyes sharp. When Teresa approached, Savannah greeted her with a nod. Captain Langford, yes. Was the child's medication destroyed mid-flight? Yes. I've reviewed the cabin report. One of my crew members confiscated a clinical trial vial and placed it in the trash compactor. Savannah didn't blink. I need names. Passenger, crew, chain of custody, and timestamps. Teresa handed her the initial log. Purser's already filing full documentation. But I'll tell you this now, it was preventable. The father tried to provide paperwork. The crew member refused to read it. Savannah's jaw tightened. Where is the flight attendant now? Still on the plane. Preparing the incident report? I'll speak to her directly. Before Teresa could answer, Savannah was already striding toward the gate. Inside the aircraft, Janet was still typing. Every word felt heavier than the last. She hadn't even reached the part where she crushed the vial. When Savannah Rhodes entered the cabin, Janet looked up slowly. Ms. Holloway? Yes. Janet replied, standing stiffly. I'm Savannah Rhodes, Executive Counsel for Calix Biosolutions. You destroyed a federally registered medical compound mid-flight. Do you understand the implications of that action? Janet nodded, but her voice caught in her throat. I was following safety protocol. You ignored the documentation provided by the parent. I didn't see any labels, no pharmacy seal, nothing recognizable. That was a clinical trial dose. You weren't expected to recognize it. You were expected to ask. Janet's face flushed. There was risk. There was procedure, Savannah countered, which you overrode. And now a child's medical outcome hangs in the balance. Janet sank into the jump seat behind her, suddenly exhausted. Am I going to be fired? I'm not the airline's HR. Savannah replied, but I will tell you this, you've placed the entire CBX-9 study under review. You've potentially compromised patient trust and integrity data, and you've handed every opposing pharmaceutical lobby a case study on negligence. Janet didn't respond. Savannah turned away. Tiana Brooks waited just outside the gate area. She hadn't posted anything yet. She knew this story needed context, nuance, not just clicks. She was young, but not naive. She'd seen what outrage without truth could become, but she also knew what silence could cost. She opened her editing software, trimmed the clip down to 90 seconds, and added a single caption. He told her it was his son's medication. She crushed it anyway. She hit upload in the ambulance. Malcolm sat beside Elijah as they raced through the Denver tarmac toward the hospital. The medic checked the boy's vitals every 2 minutes. Still stable, still breathing, but shallow. Risk was rising. Malcolm stared at the back of the medic's head, barely blinking. He had no more strength for anger. Only focus, only resolve. They reached the hospital in 9 minutes. The emergency team was waiting. A pediatric specialist rushed Elijah into triage while Malcolm followed, gripping the gray folder as if it were the last thing tethering him to reason. Inside the hospital, sterile lights and clean white walls wrapped around him like fog. A nurse took Elijah's information. The doctor asked about the medication. Malcolm handed over the calyx clearance letters. When the nurse asked what had happened to the dose, Malcolm's voice cracked for the first time all day. It was thrown away. The nurse blinked. Accidentally. No. He whispered. Not accidentally. They led him to a small waiting room with coffee he didn't drink and a television he didn't watch. He sat in silence, the way a soldier waits for news after a battle. Eventually, a young doctor entered. He's stable, the doctor said. We've administered supportive care. We need to get a replacement dose of CBX-9 within 8 hours to stay within protocol thresholds. Malcolm closed his eyes. Can you get one? We've contacted Calyx. They're expediting a courier from Phoenix. It'll be close, but we'll make it. He nodded once, and his vitals holding, but he's not out of danger. Malcolm sat back in the chair, body heavy. Outside the hospital room, a storm had begun to form, but it wasn't in the sky. It was on the ground, and it was just getting started. By the time the video had been online for an hour, it had over 4 million views. Tiana Brooks had debated whether to post it at all. She had never intended to go viral. She simply couldn't bear the idea that it would all fade into silence. That what happened on Flight 7119 would become another forgotten moment sealed behind corporate NDAs and hollow apologies. But now, it was out. News anchors across the country were replaying the clip, freezing the frame on Janet Holloway's hand reaching across the tray table. Editorials were already appearing online with titles like When Protocol Becomes Prejudice and Why Listening Could Have Saved a Child's Life. The comment sections were a mixture of outrage, heartbreak, and hard truths, and the world had taken notice. Inside Calyx Biosolutions' crisis room in Phoenix, 4 monitors displayed real-time headlines. Savannah Rhodes stood at the head of the table with her sleeves rolled up and her phone in hand. Our legal team has confirmed the destroyed dose was one of only 6 issued vials in the entire trial's 3rd phase, she said. Its loss has triggered an automatic clinical audit. We've halted all new patient admissions for 72 hours. One of the lawyers leaned forward. Do we have video confirmation of the airline's failure to review documentation? Yes, Savannah replied, turning one of the monitors to display Tiana's footage. The passenger offered verification. The crew member declined. A man in a gray suit frowned. This will cost them more than PR damage. We're not seeking compensation, Savannah said sharply. We're seeking accountability. There is a difference. At that moment, Savannah's phone buzzed again. She glanced down. Aurelia Air's CEO had requested an emergency meeting. She didn't reply. In Denver. Malcolm sat in the hospital corridor, head leaned back against the wall. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly. His coffee had gone cold in his hands. He hadn't taken a sip. Elia lay in the pediatric wing, stable but groggy. The replacement vial from Calyx was en route, escorted by private courier and armed security. Until then, they were holding his system in a delicate balance of sedatives and supplemental oxygen. The weight of the day pressed into Malcolm's chest like a lead blanket. He didn't know how to feel. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't scared either. He was simply hollow. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was an unknown number. He debated ignoring it, but instinct made him answer. "Mr. Grant," said a firm voice on the other end. "This is Derek Langston, Chief Compliance Officer at Aurelia Air. I'm calling on behalf of our executive team. First, let me say how deeply sorry we are for what happened today." Malcolm didn't reply. Langston continued. We are launching a full internal investigation. The crew member involved has been placed on immediate leave pending review. We're cooperating with Calix and the FAA to ensure this never happens again." Malcolm closed his eyes. "What do you want from me?" "To speak. At your convenience, or your silence, if that's what you need. But if you're willing to meet with us, our CEO would like to hear your perspective firsthand." Malcolm let out a slow breath. "I'm not interested in optics. This wouldn't be for optics, Mr. Grant. It would be for truth." He ended the call without confirming. Back in her apartment in Chicago, Janet Holloway sat curled on her couch, knees tucked to her chest. The lights were off. Her phone had vibrated for hours, but she hadn't answered a single call. The video had reached her mother, then her old friends, then her union rep. Now it had reached everyone. The comments were brutal, some fair, some cruel, some unhinged. Her inbox was full of messages ranging from death threats to pity to vitriol dressed as advice, but none of it compared to the echo of Malcolm's voice in her head. "You didn't just throw away a vial. You threw away the only thing that's kept my son alive." She played it again and again, trying to hear something else in it, trying to believe she hadn't meant for any of this. But a voice deeper inside her whispered the truth. She hadn't seen the father. She hadn't seen the child. She had seen a risk, a problem, a potential liability. She had failed to listen. And now, she wasn't sure how to live with that. The doorbell rang. Janet jumped. When she opened the door, it was her mother, a woman in her 70s with warm eyes and worry carved deep into her face. She pulled Janet into a hug and didn't let go. "I messed up," Janet whispered. Her mother didn't say, "It's okay." She just said, "Then you make it right." In the hospital room, Elijah stirred. His eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in hours, he blinked at the overhead lights. Malcolm rushed to his side. "Hey there, buddy." Elijah's voice was weak, but present. "Skyblade didn't leave me." "No," Malcolm said, his throat tightening. "He never does." Outside the room, Savannah arrived with the Calix courier, who handed over the new vial personally. The nurse logged the transfer. The pediatrician inspected the label 3 times before preparing the injection. Elijah received the dose at 11:03 p.m., 42 minutes within the allowed threshold. It was enough. For now, as Malcolm sat beside his son, holding his hand and listening to the soft beeping of monitors, he knew something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about every parent who had been ignored. Every rule that had become a weapon. Every procedure that had silenced common sense. His silence had spoken louder than any outburst. And now, the world had listened. The boardroom was colder than Malcolm expected. Not in temperature, but in tone. The lights were bright. The furniture was sleek. Everything smelled of polish and corporate formality. A long glass table stretched across the center of the room, ringed with executive chairs that looked expensive but uncomfortable. Malcolm stood near the window for a moment, staring out at the Denver skyline. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale orange over the rooftops and air traffic control tower in the distance. He didn't want to be here, but something deeper than reluctance had brought him in. Not anger, not even justice. Truth. He turned as the door opened. Derek Langston entered first, carrying a thin folder and a weary expression. Behind him walked a woman Malcolm recognized from newspaper profiles and investor conferences. Claudia Veer, CEO of Aurelia Air. Her hair was silver, pulled back neatly, and her expression was unreadable. "Mr. Grant," she said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." Malcolm shook her hand but didn't smile. He took the seat they offered, across from the CEO, with Derek to her right. "We won't take much of your time," Claudia began. "I want to start by acknowledging what happened to your son. We failed you. There's no excuse." Malcolm listened, unmoving. She continued, "We've already reviewed the preliminary incident reports. Your documentation was in order. Your tone, according to all witnesses, remained calm and respectful. What was done to your son's medication was not only a violation of FAA medical carriage protocols, it was a violation of human decency." Malcolm let out a quiet breath. "I didn't come for apologies." Claudia nodded. "I understand." He leaned forward slightly, voice steady. "I came because I want to know if you'll change." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed. Claudia looked at Derek, then back at Malcolm. "We've suspended the crew member involved pending review." "That's a reaction," Malcolm said. "I'm asking about change." Derek spoke next. "We've begun updating our in-flight medical training. Starting next quarter, all crew will receive scenario-based education on clinical trials and off-label medication documentation." "That's a start," Malcolm said. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and laid it on the table. It was creased, but clean. On it were 4 bullet points, handwritten. "I'd like you to consider the following," he said. Number 1, partner with Calyx and other clinical trial organizations to create a real-time verification system for rare and experimental treatments. Number 2, revise your confiscation protocol to allow for temporary isolation of medication rather than destruction. Number 3, designate 1 medically trained cabin crew member per flight for review of passenger claims. And number 4, create a passenger advocacy desk for real-time escalation, particularly involving children. He slid the paper across the table. Claudia took it silently, read it, folded it again, then looked up. "You're not suing us?" Malcolm shook his head. "Not unless you pretend this didn't happen." Her eyes narrowed, thoughtful. "Why not?" "Because I don't want a settlement. I want a shift." They sat in silence for a few moments. Then Claudia stood. She extended her hand again, this time with something almost like respect in her eyes. "You have it." Malcolm stood and shook it, firm. As he turned to leave, the door opened again. Janet Holloway stepped in. She looked different, paler, smaller. Somehow. She wasn't in uniform, just a gray cardigan and dark jeans. Her eyes met Malcolm's, then dropped quickly. "I asked to speak," she said quietly. Claudia motioned for her to come forward. Janet didn't approach the table. She stopped a few feet inside the room. "I don't expect forgiveness," she began. "What I did on that flight wasn't just procedural, it was harmful. I thought I was protecting the aircraft. I thought I was preventing risk. But what I really did was fail to listen. I failed your son." Malcolm's expression didn't change. Janet swallowed. "I filed my report. I gave it to the union. But I wanted to say this to you directly. If your son wants to know why someone threw away what kept him safe, you can tell him it was fear, not of him, but of the past." Her voice broke slightly. "My brother died from an unlabeled pill he took when I was 17. Since then, I've seen danger in every bottle without a label. But that's not an excuse. It's just a reason. And I know reasons can still ruin people." Malcolm didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "What will you do now?" Janet looked him in the eye. "I'm going back to training. Voluntarily. I've asked to be reassigned to medical protocol development for the remainder of my term. I want to help rewrite the manuals that led me to make that choice." He gave a single nod. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. As he walked out of the room, the door closed behind him with a soft thud. Downstairs in the lobby, Tiana Brooks was waiting. She stood up when she saw him. "I didn't know you were meeting with the board," she said. Malcolm gave a half smile. "You always waiting in lobbies for your stories. Only the ones that matter." He chuckled once, softly. "Then this one must matter a lot." "It does," she said. "I wanted to ask, what do you want people to take from all this?" He thought about it. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he said, "That policy without compassion is just a slower kind of cruelty, and that sometimes the quietest sentence in the room is the one that rewrites the rules." She typed it into her phone, then looked up. "I think people will listen." "I hope they do," he replied. As he stepped out into the Denver morning, the sky was clearer than it had been in days. Planes lifted in the distance, rising into the brightening light. But something had changed, even if no one saw it yet. One voice, one mistake, one act of stillness had opened the door to something better. It started in classrooms, not the ones with chalkboards or smart TVs, but the invisible classrooms of conversation at kitchen tables, coffee counters, dorm rooms, and digital comment sections where people were finally doing more than scrolling. They were sitting still, watching, listening. A short clip had gone viral again, this time not of Janet's action, but of Malcolm's words at the press conference 3 days after the meeting. He hadn't wanted to speak. He hated cameras. But Calix had asked, not for publicity, for clarity. The podium was plain. The microphones felt like eyes. And yet, when Malcolm opened his mouth, the room grew quiet. "My son didn't need sympathy," he said. "He needed respect." And when his medication was destroyed, it wasn't just a vial that got crushed. It was trust. The kind of trust we ask people to carry onto planes every day. The trust that says, "We'll take care of you." But that only works when we remember one thing. That policy without compassion is just a slower kind of cruelty. The clip was 42 seconds long, but in 42 seconds, something shifted. His voice wasn't booming. It was quiet, composed, but it landed like thunder. That night, primetime anchors quoted him. Medical ethicists discussed him on national panels. One journalist wrote, "In a time of noise, Malcolm Grant reminded us that stillness can speak louder." The hashtag, #respect before regulation, began trending. And with it came stories. A mother shared about a time her autistic son was denied boarding because his calming toy was considered suspicious. A cancer patient posted a photo of the cooler she carried between states because her treatment wasn't yet FDA approved in her home city. A nurse commented on how many times she'd seen passengers break down when a single dose of insulin was mishandled or questioned. Malcolm read some of them late at night, sitting in Elijah's hospital room while the boy slept. He didn't reply. He didn't repost. He simply read, because reading was another kind of listening, and after what happened, listening mattered more than ever. Meanwhile, inside Aurelia Air's headquarters, the legal team was scrambling to keep up with the wave. Not lawsuits, not yet, but scrutiny. The Department of Transportation had requested internal manuals for review. The FAA had quietly sent a memo to all major carriers reminding them of medical transport rights, and the Senate's Transportation Subcommittee had scheduled an emergency hearing on clinical passenger protections. What started in seat 17A had landed in Washington. Janet Holloway watched all of it unfold from the quiet of her apartment. She hadn't returned to the skies, not yet. Instead, she sat with a cup of tea most mornings and a blank journal. Her therapist, because yes, she had finally agreed to see one, had suggested she write everything she couldn't say out loud, all the things she thought, feared, believed. So that's what she did. She wrote about her brother, Daniel, and the night he stopped breathing. She wrote about her training, how the emphasis had always been safety over nuance, order over empathy. She wrote about Malcolm's eyes, how they hadn't condemned her. They had simply shown her what she'd missed. And then, one morning, she wrote a letter. She didn't send it. She didn't even sign it. But it said this: "I think the hardest part is knowing that I meant well, and still did harm. I thought following rules was enough. But now I see that rules without sight are just fences keeping people out when what they need is a door." She folded it, placed it in the back of her journal, and that was enough for now. At the hospital, Elijah was recovering faster than expected. The replacement dose had stabilized him. Calix had sent a research specialist to monitor his progress. The neurologist gave cautious optimism. Malcolm, however, still lived in short bursts of breath. He didn't smile unless Elijah did. He didn't sleep unless Elijah stirred. And even though the world now called him a hero, he didn't feel like one. One afternoon, Elijah looked up from his drawing and asked, "Did I do something wrong?" Malcolm froze. He sat beside his son and gathered the small boy into his lap. "No, baby, not one thing." Then why did they throw it away? Malcolm searched for the words. They didn't understand it. They didn't understand you. And sometimes, when people don't understand something, they treat it like it doesn't matter. Elijah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "But I do matter." Malcolm kissed the crown of his head. More than anything. A week later, Aurelia Air quietly released a new policy. It included mandatory documentation training for all crew, real-time verification tools through partnerships with clinical trial providers, and an internal passenger advocate on every long-haul flight. It didn't undo the past, but it rewrote the future, and it bore a new name: the Elijah Protocol. Media outlets ran the story widely. Some praised the airline's transparency. Others questioned why it had taken public shame to act. Malcolm didn't weigh in, but when Tiana asked him how he felt, he gave her a sentence she carried with her for the rest of her career. "It's not about whether people change because of you. It's about whether they're willing to change at all. And sometimes it only takes one person not backing down for the rest to stand up." Tiana later published a full feature in The Atlantic titled "The Man Who Grounded a Flight Without Raising His Voice." It went viral for the second time, not because it was sensational, but because it was true. She ended the piece with a single image, a photo she had taken, candidly, without asking, during one of her visits to the hospital. Malcolm, sitting beside Elijah's bed, the boy asleep, skyblade in hand, the father, head bowed, fingers laced in prayer, no words, just presence. And that said everything. It started with a crayon, bright red, thick and slightly worn. Elijah sat cross-legged on the hospital bed, tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth in focused silence. The paper in front of him was a simple white sheet folded once down the middle. One half had a drawing skyblade flying through clouds, arms outstretched, cape flapping like a banner. The other half held his words. At first, Malcolm thought it was just another one of Elijah's daily drawings. Since his recovery, he'd been sketching everyday robots, clouds, spaceships, the occasional stick-figure dinosaur. But this one was different. When Malcolm leaned over and read what his son had written in large, crooked block letters, he froze. "Dear lady from the airplane," it began. Elijah looked up at his father, eyes wide but steady. "I want to send her a letter," he said. Malcolm hesitated. "Are you sure she didn't like my medicine? Maybe if I tell her why it helps, she won't do that again." There was no bitterness in his voice, no blame, just a simple desire to be understood. Malcolm sat back slowly, heart tightening. Elijah handed him the letter. It wasn't long. "Dear lady from the airplane, my name is Elijah. I had a bottle and you took it. That made me very scared. I don't like seizures. They make my head feel like it's breaking. The bottle helps me. My dad says it's called CBX, and he calls it a miracle. I don't know what a miracle is, but I think it means something big and good. I'm not mad at you, but I think maybe next time you can ask before throwing it away. Maybe I can show you how it works. Then you'll see it's not scary, just small and important. Also, Skyblade says hi." From Elijah, Malcolm stared at the words. He wasn't sure whether to cry or laugh or sit there in stunned reverence. Somehow, his 7-year-old had written the thing no adult could manage. Not legal, not procedural, just human. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his bag. Later that day, he made a call. The receptionist at Aurelia Air's HR office answered on the third ring. "This is Malcolm Grant. I need to deliver something to one of your employees." When Janet Holloway opened the manila envelope left at the front desk 2 days later, she expected another form, another statement to sign, maybe even another formal complaint. Instead, it was Elijah's letter. She read it once, then again, and again. Each time, the words hit differently. Her eyes burned before she even realized she was crying. She read the line about miracles, and something broke inside her. She read the part about Skyblade, and something healed. She folded the paper and held it to her chest. She didn't speak for the rest of the day. She didn't need to. 3 days later, a video appeared on the internal airline portal. It was Janet. No makeup, no uniform, just her, sitting in front of a blank wall with Elijah's letter in her lap. She looked into the camera and began. "This is the hardest thing I've ever done, but I owe it to the boy who forgave me before I knew how to forgive myself." She explained the events of that flight in full, not the edited version, not the union-advised statement, but the truth. She spoke about her fear, about her brother, about the moment she saw the vial and reacted instead of asking. And then she read Elijah's letter out loud, voice trembling. "I don't like seizures. They make my head feel like it's breaking." She paused, swallowed. He trusted me with something precious, and I failed him. By the time the 6-minute video ended, comments were flooding the company's internal board, some angry, some tearful, some grateful. A crew member from Miami wrote, "I've made that same call before. Janet, your honesty just changed the way I'll fly forever." A gate agent from Seattle posted, "Every passenger has a story. I forgot that once. Thank you for reminding me." Even Claudia Veer sent an internal memo. "Empathy is not weakness." She wrote, "It is precision." And Janet Holloway reminded us what real leadership looks like. Word spread outside the airline. Tiana Brooks picked it up and reached out for permission to use part of the video in a follow-up story. The title read, "The Apology That Didn't Ask for Redemption, But Earned It Anyway." The comment sections lit up. One mother wrote, "I watched this with my daughter. We cried together." A former flight attendant commented, "This isn't about blame. It's about growth." Meanwhile, Elijah's recovery continued. He was back to running short laps around the pediatric floor, playing make-believe rescue missions with Skyblade in one hand and a popsicle in the other. Malcolm watched him sometimes and tried to make sense of how a child so fragile could carry a world-changing strength inside such a small frame. Doctors called it resilience. Malcolm called it grace. Then one morning, a package arrived. It was addressed to Elijah. Inside was a soft plush toy shaped like Skyblade, complete with a removable cape and a stitched-on lightning bolt. But it wasn't the toy that made Malcolm pause. It was the card tucked inside. In slanted cursive, it read, "Dear Elijah, you were right. I didn't understand, but now I do. Thank you for your letter. I hope the Skyblade reminds you that you are never alone in the sky. Keep being brave. From your friend in the air." Janet Elijah beamed. He held the plush tightly and whispered, "Skyblade has a cousin now." Malcolm smiled, then wiped a tear from his cheek before Elijah could see. The letter had changed something, not just in Janet, but in everyone. Across the country, other airlines began consulting with Calix and similar biotech firms. Workshops were launched. A nonprofit was formed, spearheaded by Calix and backed by Elijah's story, called One Bottle, One Life. Its mission: protect the medical rights of vulnerable passengers in every airborne space. Its logo was simple, a small red crayon, and beneath it, in Elijah's handwriting, just small and important, the world hadn't forgotten. It had remembered. Because a child had spoken when adults stayed silent. Because a father had stayed calm when chaos was easier. Because a mistake had become a moment, and a moment had become a movement. The stage was small. It wasn't a big national event or a press-heavy conference. Just a gathering room inside the Denver Children's Health Center, where the hospital's research staff hosted an annual family day for patients and their families. They set up folding chairs, printed name tags, and laid out cookies that tasted slightly like cardboard but were always eaten anyway. This year, the room was a little fuller than usual, because this year, Elijah Grant had been invited to speak, not because of what happened on the plane, though everyone knew, not because of Malcolm's speech or Janet's video or the viral articles that still circulated online, but because someone had read Elijah's letter and thought, "This child understands something we don't." The invitation came handwritten, signed by one of the child life specialists who had watched Elijah grow from a scared, nonverbal 5-year-old into a wide-eyed, sharp-tongued 7-year-old who could now recite every Skyblade mission in perfect order. Malcolm hesitated at first. "Elijah," he said gently, sitting on the edge of the bed, "you don't have to say anything. You don't want to. You've already done so much." Elijah looked up from the Skyblade plush in his lap. "Will they listen?" Malcolm paused. "I think they will." "Then I'll go." So there they were, a week later, surrounded by nurses, parents, volunteers, and a handful of local journalists who had gotten wind of the event and quietly asked for permission to attend. Tiana Brooks was there too. She didn't bring her press badge this time, just her notepad. Janet Holloway sat in the back corner, wearing a quiet smile and holding a box of tissues, just in case. Elijah stood in front of the small microphone, his little fingers brushing the edge of the podium. The mic was too tall, so a nurse had brought out a small step stool and gently helped him climb it. He didn't look scared. He looked steady, like Skyblade before liftoff. "Hi," he said into the mic. "I'm Elijah. I'm 7, and I want to tell you about Skyblade." Laughter rippled through the room, light and warm. Elijah smiled. "Skyblade is a superhero. But he doesn't punch bad guys. He helps them understand. When someone's scared, he doesn't yell. He asks questions. That's his real power. Asking? Malcolm blinked, breath catching. Elijah continued. One day, Skyblade was on a flight, and someone took away his special gear. He felt really small. But then, he remembered something his dad told him, that even when people don't see you, you can still shine. So Skyblade didn't scream. He waited. He listened. And when it was time, he told the truth. Not to be mean, just to help people learn. The room had gone completely still. Not even the nurses were moving. Elijah reached into his backpack and pulled out the letter. The same one he'd written weeks ago. He held it up like a badge. This is my letter. I wrote it because someone didn't understand me. But then she did. And that helped her become a hero too. Now we're both heroes. I think that's what grown-ups call a team. Janet dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Malcolm smiled through a quiet tear. Elijah leaned toward the mic once more. If you ever feel like someone doesn't see you, don't stop shining, because even the sky listens when you're brave. Applause erupted not loud, but deep, the kind that carries something heavier than noise, the kind that wraps you like a hug. Afterward, a dozen parents approached Malcolm, one mother with twin boys, a father who'd traveled from New Mexico just to say thank you. He gave my daughter words. One said, choking up. She's never spoken in front of anyone before. But tonight, she whispered, I want to be brave like him. Malcolm nodded, overwhelmed. That evening, after most of the guests had left, Tiana approached Elijah with a quiet smile. Do you know what you just did? She asked gently. Elijah nodded. A flu. She laughed. Yeah, you really did. Then she turned to Malcolm. You know, when I first boarded that flight, I thought I was just flying home to finish my senior project. I didn't know I was about to meet a boy who would rewrite everything I believed about courage. Malcolm looked down at Elijah, who was now examining the cookie table like it held national secrets. He teaches me something new every day, he said softly. Do you think I could quote his speech in my next piece? Malcolm smiled. You'll have to ask him. He runs PR now. Tiana laughed again, wiped her eyes, and walked over to Elijah to get his permission. Later that night, back in their hospital room, Elijah curled up with his Skyblade plush and looked up at his father. Did I help someone today? You helped a lot of people, Malcolm said. Even the lady from the airplane. Malcolm nodded, especially her. Elijah's eyes closed slowly. Then I can rest now. Malcolm watched as his son drifted into sleep, peaceful and safe. He leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes, and breathed for the first time in what felt like years. Outside the window, the Denver skyline glowed soft and gold under the evening sky. Planes lifted into the horizon, as they always had. But for the first time in a long while, Malcolm felt like they were flying toward something better, something brighter, something Elijah had helped build. He looked out at the sky and whispered the only words that felt right. Thank you, son, because sometimes the greatest teachers don't come with titles or degrees or applause. Sometimes they come with a red crayon, a stuffed superhero, and a letter that changed everything. The sun was setting over Denver, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. From the hospital window, Malcolm watched the planes taxi and take off, their silhouettes cutting graceful arcs into the fading light. It felt peaceful. A quiet promise that life, no matter how fragile, moved forward. Elijah was asleep beside him, The soft rise and fall of his chest, the most precious sound Malcolm had ever known. He thought about how far they had come. The chaos, the fear, the moments of silence so heavy they nearly broke him. But most of all, he thought about the moments of light. The letter Elijah had written, Janet's apology, the way a community had gathered, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes passionately, around a little boy who had taught them all how to see. Outside the hospital, the One Bottle, One Life Foundation was already taking shape. The nonprofit aimed to protect passengers like Elijah, those who carried experimental treatments, who lived with conditions the world barely understood. It wasn't just about policy or protocol anymore. It was about humanity. Malcolm had become its quiet champion, not because he sought attention, but because he knew what silence cost. One evening, as Malcolm helped Elijah with his homework, the phone rang. It was Janet Holloway. Her voice was tentative but steady. "I wanted to say thank you," she said. "For what?" "For your forgiveness, and for showing me that sometimes the hardest flight is the one inside ourselves." Malcolm smiled softly. "It's not about forgiving, Janet. It's about learning. We all fly with baggage. The question is whether we let it weigh us down or lift us higher." Janet's laughter was light on the line. "Maybe I'm ready to fly higher now." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Elijah's nurse peeked in. "Your dad's here," she whispered. Malcolm looked up to see a visitor he hadn't expected. Savannah Rhodes. She carried a small box wrapped in blue paper. "I brought something for Elijah," she said, smiling gently. Inside was a custom-made Skyblade figure, hand-painted, with intricate details, a gift from Calyx Biosolutions to honor Elijah's courage and the hope he inspired. Elijah's eyes sparkled as he held it carefully. "Now Skyblade can fight all the shadows," he said, hugging the figure tight. Savannah looked at Malcolm. "Your son's bravery changed more than a trial or an airline. It changed hearts." Malcolm nodded. The sky remembers. Months later, the story of Flight 719 was still unfolding in unexpected ways. Janet Holloway had returned to flying, but with a new purpose. She was now part of the airline's medical training advisory board, helping rewrite protocols to include empathy and communication. Malcolm was often invited to speak at conferences, sharing lessons on advocacy and resilience, but he always brought Elijah along. Because Elijah was more than a patient or a symbol. He was a teacher. One chilly autumn afternoon, Malcolm and Elijah stood beneath a giant mural painted on a hospital wall. It was a vibrant tribute to Flight 719's story. Skyblade soared across the mural, his cape trailing stars and light. Below him, children of all backgrounds reached toward the sky, their faces hopeful. A plaque beside the painting read, "In honor of Elijah Grant, whose courage taught us that every life is a story worth hearing and every voice is a light in the darkness." Elijah looked up at his father. "Do you think Skyblade would be proud?" Malcolm smiled, kneeling to meet his son's gaze. "I know he would." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched like wings, Malcolm realized that their journey was not just about survival. It was about transformation, about how a single act, small, quiet, yet fierce, could ripple across worlds, about how love and truth could rewrite even the highest sky, and how, sometimes, the most profound journeys happen not in soaring heights or distant lands, but in the simple act of being seen. The sky remembers, and so would they. This story reminds us how fragile life is, and how easily a moment of prejudice can threaten what matters most. Malcolm and Elijah's journey is a testament to the power of love, resilience, and standing up even when the odds seem impossible. Yet it also shines a harsh light on the cost of discrimination wrapped in silence and protocol. We owe it to every family to listen, to question, and to act with empathy. Thank you for sharing this story with us. If it moved you, please like, share, and subscribe so we can bring you more real stories that inspire, challenge, and connect us all. Stay with us because the fight for justice and understanding is just beginning, and every voice counts.